Was I muted?
Yes.
Oh, sorry about that. Okay, I must have muted myself when I let everybody in. Apologies. So we're here with Will and Sarah from Hydrovane to discuss wind self-steering and alternate energies. I've got the recording going. That'll be available in about a day by email to you guys. And the chat box is open for questions. So I'm going to just turn it over to them.
I will unmute. Okay, hi everybody. Hopefully this is working well. We're having very minor technical difficulties here. I'm just trying to close down a couple things on my computer that seem to be bogging it down. Okay, so thank you so much for joining today. I'm Sarah Curry, this is Will, and my husband, and we're going to be talking a little bit about wind vane self-steering and then touching on a few other alternative energy kind of things. So what I would love to do is I'm going to share my screen and the PowerPoint. We have a group of about 20, so I think if you can have any questions, just type them into the chat and we'll try and ask them. We'll try and answer kind of during the presentation. And certainly at one point we're going to get up here and give you a little bit of a demo on our good friend the Hydrovane here. So that's a good time to chime in if there's anything very specific that you'd like us to show you. And we also have the 1C behind us too. Yeah. So we're calling you today from Vancouver. We're in our office here, and oh, we've got okay, there we go. All right, let me get to it. Okay. Yeah. All right, so here we go. March 2023, and we're going to talk to you about wind vane self-steering. I'll just move us over a bit in case that's better. So a little intro to begin with, then we'll go through some of the various different types of wind vane self-steering systems that are out there. We'll get to the point where we give the demonstration, and then we like to talk about autopilots, emergency steering, go through some installation things, and then we've added some stuff about alternative energies, and then we can also do more Q&A at the end if needed. So Hydrovane, what is it? Who are we? What's going on here? Wind vane self-steering systems have been around, of course, for a lot longer than electronic autopilots. So the first commercialized systems came onto the market over 50 years ago, back in 1968. There were two that were the early manufacturers, one being Hydrovane, which is our family business now, and one being Aries, which is a servo pendulum wind vane based in Holland. Yeah, okay. So these have come a long way. We are involved with Hydrovane because over 20 years ago, the business was bought by Will's parents. They were actually planning to go offshore cruising again, and they were looking for a bracket for a used Hydrovane that they had actually bought. So they contacted the original engineer designer of the product, and he said, look, I can get you that part, but I'm actually thinking of passing on the business, so it better be quick. And I know the story goes that Will's mom said, hey, get back on the phone with that guy. And instead of buying, you know, the Hydrovane part, they ended up buying many, many Hydrovanes and sold their boat and didn't actually end up going cruising again. So the Currys have owned Hydrovane for 21 years. We manufacture in England, but we of course have our offices here in Canada, in Vancouver. We're Canadian, and Will and I work remotely. We spend about 6 months of the year working from our boat. In the past 10 years, there have been a lot of developments. So steering bigger, faster, heavier boats, which has of course been the trend in cruising boats. So there we are. That's Will and his family when they were cruising in 1996. And I know. And then a picture of our family, our young family from a couple of years ago. This was us down in Mexico last winter with our twin boys. Okay, I mean, our experience, we have done a fair amount of cruising. We crossed the Pacific on our first boat back in 2013. And that was before I joined the business. And I was like, what is this red thing on the back? I don't even understand what it does. I was fairly new to sailing. And I honestly now can't even imagine sailing without it. So that was over 10 years ago.
Our previous one was taken in Fiji.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Passed away, the Tom Hanks movie in the background.
Yeah. Our second boat, sorry, just to go back, this was a Beneteau First 405, kind of racer cruiser. Our second boat was a Jeanneau 43, which we had for 7 years. We love that boat. We bought her up here in the Pacific Northwest and sailed her down to Mexico. And we just sold her under a year ago down in Mexico. And our current boat that we also bought last year is a Leopard 46. So we have moved to the 2-hull family. Twins equals 2 hulls, I guess. And she's over in Greece. So we fly back there in a month. Okay, let's get to the real subject here, wind vane self-steering.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not sure how many people would have sailed with a wind vane, but it's actually the real beauty of it is that it's all mechanical, and it's not tied into, well, the Hydrovane itself is not tied into the main steering on the boat. One of the biggest differences compared to an autopilot is that you're always steering an apparent wind-based course, whereas an autopilot, generally speaking, is steering to a compass-based course. They do have wind functions to steer to the wind with various degrees of effectiveness. And of course, it's always mounted on the back of the boat, you know, depending on, some are off center and some are center line, depending on the nature of the transom. When we were crossing the Pacific, we always made a point of trying to go through the main anchorages and do these informal surveys to try and figure out what kind of gear people were using, what was working and what didn't. One of these places was in Naiafu, Tonga, which is kind of a main crossroads for boats that are heading west. In this anchorage, there were 26 cruising boats, and out of those 26 cruising boats, 19 of them had wind vanes. It's just interesting to point out that fact because, you know, when you're cruising locally, you don't see that many wind vanes because generally speaking, our customers and people that are going cruising, they're elsewhere in the world. This is a good example of 3 different systems. You can see on the left there, that was our Beneteau with the Hydrovane mounted slightly off center. Next to us were some Swedish friends of ours on a Nicholson 31 that were sailing with an old Aries wind vane. And then beside them was another Swedish boat, friends of ours on an Allegro 27, and they had a smaller light duty, I believe it was called the Sea Feather, also a servo pendulum system. This is a good quote, and I like to bring this up, especially when we're doing presentations at boat shows. I always like to point out to people that second to only keeping the boat afloat is making sure she's pointing in the right direction. And it sounds very basic and obvious, but I find that especially during boat shows when we're walking around and we're seeing all these fancy gizmos and gadgets, which are great. But at the end of the day, you really do need to focus on the fact that you got to keep your boat going in the right direction. You got to keep her afloat. So to get into the different systems, the first type would be the servo pendulum style system. A well-known American brand would be the Monitor. There's also the Aries, the Cape Horn, and the Fleming, which is made in Australia.
And the Wind Pilot is the big one
in Germany.
Out of Germany, yeah.
Yeah, so basically what you're doing with these systems is you've got a vane that's sensing the signal. So you set the leading edge of the vane into the wind, depending on what point of sail you're on. That vane flops over and sends a signal down to a servo oar, and that servo oar twists. And as it twists, it shoots it off to one side or the other. And that movement from side to side is transferred through lines and blocks to your main rudder, to your main steering, sorry. So it depends on whether you have tiller steering or wheel steering. The other way of doing it is the Cape Horn wind vane, which actually has a 3-inch hole that they drill through the transom and actually tied into your main quadrant. So it links right onto the quadrant directly. So with all of these servo style systems, the vane is actually driving the boat's main rudder. And that's an important differentiator. The next type of system would be a servo auxiliary. This is basically a servo concept. It's the same servo concept, except that it's not linked into the boat's main rudder. It's actually driving its own auxiliary rudder. So it's using a signal from the vane down to the servo oar, and that servo oar is linked to its own rudder. These systems were quite expensive to manufacture, and they had a lot of moving parts, and breakage was an issue. As far as I know, nobody manufactures them anymore. Wind Pilot and Fleming both used to, and so did Salomat, but they've all since abandoned this model because it was just not economical to produce. Another type of system would be an auxiliary trim tab style system. This would either be like the Auto Helm, which Scanmar produces in California, or there's an old version called the RBG, which is long out of production, but it uses the same principle. And with this setup, you're using a vane that's directly driving a trim tab. And as the trim tab moves, it actually moves the auxiliary rudder. So the boat's main rudder is fixed, and it's just relying purely on the trim tab and the main rudder itself. I actually did a passage to Hawaii, or our family trip when we were younger. We had an RVG, and we did a passage out to Hawaii, and then from Hawaii back up to the Pacific Northwest. So I do know the auxiliary rudder trim tab concept quite well.
So there's some story about your dad jumping in the water for that.
Yes, one of the bolts came out on the trim tab about 1,000 miles out, and he had to jump overboard to try and fix it. And unfortunately, we were not able to. So the system had its flaws. And then the final would be the auxiliary rudder system like the Hydrovane, which is basically, it has its own vane directly linked through a ratio control. And that ratio control goes down through the shaft and drives its own semi-balanced rudder. So it's completely independent from the main steering. Part of the reason why the vane is so big is because that's where it generates its power. So the vane itself is much larger than what you would see on like a servo pendulum unit. And then the ratio control, the linkage in the gears allows you to tune it up or down depending on conditions. And I'll show you that on the actual unit itself.
Yeah, and we do have to apologize. You may hear it in our voices, but we've been really, really ill the last week. So we're finally better today, which was good timing, but we don't exactly normally sound like this. Okay, so in terms of setting up a wind vane and kind of tuning it for the conditions, we can talk a little bit about that. I will try and play this video, which hopefully comes through okay. And this was on our last boat sailing down the coast of California. And after that, we'll move over to the Hydrovane to show you again what it's all about. I need to pull that up. Yeah, so with all wind vanes, the way that you set your course is the same. So you're using either a line, a remote course setting line, or directly on the unit to move the vane. You can see our red vane up there, so that it is in iron, so it's kind of directly into the wind. And that is the course that you're going to hold. And we'll explain that a little bit better. Here's another video. So if it's working correctly, even if you're in quite big, heavy conditions, the vane will go back and forth evenly on both sides. And when you're standing tall, you're on course. But then, of course, you're going to kind of fall off course at some point and the other way. And it just kind of is this motion back and forth. So here is just some video footage of in slightly stronger conditions. So yeah, you can see that they had their boat balanced pretty well. Their wheels are probably locked off, slightly off center, but the vane is doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing to keep them on course.
When it's engaged properly, the vane will move at sort of similar deflections to both sides. If you see the vane constantly deflecting to one side, then you know that it's trying to overcome a bit of weather helm that the boat has, or poorly balanced boat.
Yeah. Okay, so we are going to now do a little bit of a demonstration and see if I can get myself off this screen sharing. Stop share. Okay. So this is, as I always say, my Pilates exercise for the day for my arms to try and stay steady. And Will may have to direct me a little bit. I'll stand over here. Okay.
Okay, so this is the line. This is the remote course setting line that you can see there. And so this runs forward to somewhere near the helm. Usually you run it down the lifeline so you can easily have this within an arm's reach. And this is essentially just an endless loop that drives a worm gear, and that actually rotates the vane. Sarah, if you can look up a bit, it actually rotates the vane around.
We're dealing with some height restrictions in the office. But...
So if we had, let's say we are on a beam reach, there's our beam reach, should be right about here. So the vane, yeah, over here actually.
Okay, good.
So the leading edge is into the wind. The boat is tracking this way. So the apparent wind's coming from here. And what we do is we leave this. We've got the unit disengaged here. So I don't know if you can see, the rudder, the drive unit there. So it's disengaged. And this is just free trailing. So the tiller and the rudder are free trailing and following the boat. And then we engage it. And now what happens is the unit's engaged, your main rudder's locked off. And as the boat falls off course, the vane goes over, which drives the rudder. See that down there? So the rudder is actually moving back and forth. That deflection moving the rudder is what keeps the boat tracking.
Now you may wonder how that tiny little thing down there can actually steer the boat. That, of course, is not the full rudder. That is just the demo rudder. So Will, if you just grab the rudder is actually about 43 inches long and it's quite a substantial beast. So that is what ends up steering your boat. There we go. Now we can, there was a question that I saw come through about what type of conditions would the vane work effectively in?
Yeah, so essentially with any wind vane, the windier it gets, the better it performs. The Achilles heel for a lot of wind vanes is the light airs downwind stuff. I think that's where auxiliary rudder systems really outshine the servo systems, because we don't need boat speed to generate power. So when we get into those lighter conditions, if we don't have boat speed, it doesn't matter because we're still getting power from the vane to drive the rudder. What you can do is you can actually tune the vane for the conditions. So what you do is,
I'm gonna come over here now so we can show you these settings.
So what you do is there's 3 different settings here. So that's disengaged. And then there's light to moderate conditions, which is a 3-to-1 leverage. So that's your maximum sensitivity, maximum power setting. And then we've got a 2-to-1 and a 1-to-1 ratio. And the 1-to-1 gives you the most amount of rudder deflection, but the least amount of power because you've got more apparent wind to overcome. Then on top of that, you can actually change the axis of the vane. So I won't do it because I'll bonk Sarah in the head here, but you can actually rotate the vane to axis aft. So in heavy weather, you depower it, and in light airs, you bring it up. We find that a lot of people get so focused on heavy weather sailing, and really the heavy weather stuff is such a small percentage of your sailing. All vanes are going to perform in heavy weather, but obviously it depends on what your sort of storm tactics are. It's really important that you get something that works well in light to moderate conditions, because that can be a lot of your sailing, especially for most east to west circumnavigations.
Will, maybe you can explain again just about, I'll go down and show the kind of rudder deflection just in the different gear settings. Sure. Just so you can actually, that makes a little bit more sense. So there is the rudder.
This is lighter, 15 degrees rudder deflection. So that's your light to moderate. And then you've got your middle setting, which is 25 degrees rudder deflection. And then you've got your heavy weather setting, which is actually 35 degrees rudder from side to side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think with wind vanes, people do get a little bit confused there, because especially when there is so much wind, you have so much power. So for the Hydrovane, you're actually kind of detuning it so that you're not steering this big snake wake, so it's not oversteering the boat when you have a lot of wind.
One other thing too I wanted to show was just for using it as emergency rudder.
Yes.
So if you had a steering failure, or you had some sort of issue that you needed to take over with the Hydrovane, all you do is disengage it, and away you go. You can actually use.
So now the Hydrovane tiller is steering the Hydrovane rudder. Yeah. Okay, if we have any specific questions right now on any of that stuff, feel free to ask, but we can always come back to those as well. Okay, I will go back to jumping into the presentation. Oops. Okay, so there is a job. There's definitely a job with wind vanes, and your job mainly comes down to sail trim and steering the boat, setting up the boat so that it is very well balanced.
This also applies to autopilots too.
Yeah, it does. Yeah,
autopilots, we get a little lazy.
Yeah. So we come, well, we don't hear it that much, but like, why isn't it working? So we say, okay, look at your sails. Like, what are you doing? Do you have slatting sails? Are you using a pole on your head sail? Do you have a proportionate sail plan? Are you feeling like the boat is overpowered? Before you set up or before you engage any wind vane, you have to feel like the boat is well balanced and almost wants to steer itself.
Yeah, when you let go of the wheel, the boat's going to want to track the direction you're going. If you're finding that it's fighting and really wants to round up or fall off, then you're going to have a hard time steering. The vane will have a hard time steering, and an autopilot will have a hard time steering. And that's why a lot of autopilots fail, is because the boats aren't trimmed or balanced properly.
So the vane is the teacher.
Exactly.
Of course, with a wind vane, you also have to watch your heading. So it's not like an autopilot where you're just saying, okay, I want to go 180 degrees south. It's here, you're actually setting the vane at a angle to the wind. So you are setting kind of a point of sail. If you get on your course where you want to go and you happen to be on a beam reach at that point, you set the vane to the beam reach. If the wind shifts, then your course is going to shift. So, and this can, especially in, trade wind conditions, can happen very gradually, and it's really not a big deal. We have never minded sailing a few more miles, but knowing that we didn't have to go and kind of retrim the sails, we're just nicely balanced. Did we?
Here. So,
Okay, well, we'll get to that. And then the last thing is adjusting for conditions. So some wind vanes will have different vanes that you swap out, bigger vane for light air, smaller vane for heavier conditions. And I think we already showed you kind of for Hydrovane, you're depowering it and you have ways to do that right on the wind vane itself. You're not changing out the actual vane.
So this is a good example of what Sarah was talking about, how you're always steering in a parent wind-based course. This was on our passage from Fiji to Vanuatu. And it was the first time in our Pacific crossing that we really had strong winds forward of the beam. And we were on a sort of close reach to close haul. The wind was supposed to be coming from the southeast, but it was more of a southerly to southwest. And
it was so wet.
It was wet and it was uncomfortable. So after, half a day of fighting it, we said, let's just fall off a bit and make the boat more comfortable. And so we did. We fell off onto a close reach to a beam reach, and the boat was happier. There was less water coming over the bow. The vane was steering nicely. And so we just left it at that. And we went that way for a day and a half. And we sort of thought, well, it's not the end of the world. Maybe we'll just make landfall at, an island further north in the chain. And then what you see there is we actually didn't change anything. We didn't adjust the course of the vane. We didn't change the configuration. The vane came around, the course came around by itself because the vane was following the wind, and the wind shifted to the south-southeast that it was supposed to. And so we ended up having a really nice passage with the boat being comfortable. And yes, we probably sailed more miles than we would have if we'd gone from A to B, but I can tell you right now that the boat was happier and we were happier.
Yeah, and the wind very much cooperated that day.
We love our autopilot. Yes, we do. But I think in an ideal world, they both have their time and place. I know on our sailing through the Pacific that our autopilot probably steered less than 10%. And I would say the Hydrovane was probably 85, and there's maybe 5% or less where we were hand steering through squalls and, real fluky conditions. This is a good picture because it shows the realities of dealing with an autopilot. And, our autopilot, all the parts are sort of mounted in very obscure, hard to get at locations on the boat. So picture doing this, hanging upside down, trying to fix something if you're in a 2, 3, 4 meter swell and the boat's rocking around all over the place. It's really, really difficult. And it also is a recipe for getting seasick. I know for me personally, I do get some seasickness. And one of the things that I really strongly try to avoid is, hanging upside down or putting my head below my knees, because it just makes me feel more seasick. So it's just important to think what it would actually be like in these scenarios.
And if you could even fix anything anyways. I mean, that's the reality. If your autopilot goes, a lot of people would not actually really know how to deal with that.
Yeah.
Not to mention the amperage draw of an autopilot. So you're depending on a lot of systems for steering. You're depending on your autopilot itself. You're depending on all of your charging systems, your batteries. And we definitely, like when we're offshore, when we're sailing even smaller passages, we don't want to run our engine if there's wind. We've never ever had to run our engine to charge, which I think is a really, really nice way to set up your boat if you can.
I remember we were we were part of the puddle jump leaving from Puerto Vallarta to the Marquesas, and that's a 3,000-mile passage. And I was talking to this guy before when we were in Puerto Vallarta, and I also saw him when we were on the other side, and I said, he was relying on autopilot. What did you do to support your autopilot? Like, how much were you having to run your engine to keep up with the power demands? And he kind of pulled me aside sheepishly and said, I was running my engine 3 to 4 hours a day to keep up with our autopilot loads. And he also had a good solar bank, but in the South Pacific, you get a lot less solar input. And we always find that when you're at sea, because of the rolling and shading, your solar input is about half of what you would normally get.
Reliability of the autopilot. Yeah, ours did break actually. This was on our first boat and we used it, we were coming out of Nandi, Vunda Point Marina, and we've been waiting there for quite a while for the right weather window to make our jump over to Vanuatu. And so we were motoring out the kind of inner area of the reef there, and all of a sudden our boat just went 90 degrees over. And yeah, the autopilot, we couldn't figure it out. We tried a little bit.
I thought that maybe we'd reposition some metal or something that was in the fluxgate compass, or
Yeah.
anyway, we weren't able to fix it.
But this one really hit home for me because our kind of train of thought was, oh, well, you know, yeah, we're heading off on like a 500-mile passage, but we know we're not going to use our autopilot anyways. We knew there was wind. We knew we'd be using the wind vane to steer. So we just continued going. And we also didn't miss that passage with all of our buddy boats, which was nice. Oh yeah, that was the weather system that we were waiting out. So this is the old school grid viewer. 10 years ago, this is kind of what you looked at. Not windy, not predict wind. It's all the same information, but it just looks pretty old school. So yeah, that's the system that we were waiting, and we've already waited for 2 weeks. So when things break, it's frustrating. Yeah. And they certainly do, but not having it be the autopilot is nice.
The other point to the story is that we actually had a little small tiller pilot, a Marine 1000, that we hooked up to the Hydrovane. And you can do this with all manufacturers of wind vanes, and you can actually drive the wind vane using a tiller pilot. And this is amazing how well it works, because for the Hydrovane specifically, it's actually driving the Hydrovane semi-balanced rudder, which takes very little power to turn. So any tiller pilot will drive it. And you're only using it when you're motoring or if you're in light conditions. And then as soon as you're sailing, you're using the vane. We ran this way all the way to Australia, just relying on the tiller pilot and the vane itself. Once our main autopilot failed, it's a cheap way of
if we were motoring, which wasn't much.
It's a cheap way of having redundancy. A $350 autopilot. And you basically have a backup autopilot. It's a much easier way to justify the cost of investing in it.
Yeah, we were messaging just yesterday with a customer who he's in Yap, and he's heading to Palau. I think it's about 200 miles. Don't quote me on that, but he knows it's light conditions. He's actually going to be motoring because he has to go back to Palau because his autopilot died and he has to pick up some parts. So he messaged us and said, hey, I bought this tiller pilot. I'd actually never set it up before onto the Hydrovane, but I guess I'll do that and go, instead of having a hand steer while motoring for 2 days. So definitely a nice thing to have.
Yeah, we were talking about the complexities of an autopilot. So that picture on the left there gives you a good idea of all the systems on board that need to be working properly to be able to have a functioning autopilot. So a lot of times it's not just the autopilot, it's your charging system to support the batteries, it's your batteries, it's your linkage between the batteries and the autopilot itself. It's something in your steering system, a quadrant failure, a linkage failure. There's so many different variables for there. So if you can cut that all out by going with a wind vane, you'll be a lot more confident in your systems on board.
Emergency steering, because the Hydrovane does classify as an emergency rudder and complete emergency steering system. We do actually hear a lot of stories. The photo here is actually their family friends, and they were sailing again to the Marquesas. A lot of our kind of topics are Pacific driven because this is where we're based, but we'll be in the Atlantic soon enough. Yeah, so their quadrant cracked. They were only a day out from the Marquesas, but they could no longer use their main rudder. They were motoring at the time, and they ended up just using the Hydrovane tiller and Hydrovane rudder to that last day to get into port. And yeah, we have quite a few stories.
This is another story from Motiva 49, the boat on the left there. Brand new boat, meticulously maintained. They were sailing to the Canaries.
They were sailing from the Canaries to the Caribbean, and their main rudder just fell off.
No, it didn't fall off. The rudder post sheared.
Yeah,
and it was a
sheared,
clean break right at the water line. So there was no water coming in the boat, but they had no rudder. Yeah. And so they're able to divert course to the Cape Verdes, and they used the Hydrovane to steer them 5 days into port. Otherwise, they would have been stuck there spinning circles trying to work out a emergency rudder jury rig. The photo on the right, that's the photo from our Juno 43, just comparing the rudder sizes. And a lot of people ask us, well, how can such a small rudder steer such a big boat? And the reality is, because the Hydrovane rudder is so much further aft on the boat, it's got a huge lever arm. And as soon as you get any sort of boat speed on, you don't need a lot of surface area to keep a boat tracking well, especially if it's balanced. And then when you do have a functioning main rudder, your main rudder actually acts as a trim tab to the Hydrovane rudder by being locked off. So you've got a lot more stability when you're going downwind, especially in big quartering seas. You'll find the boat will ride a lot nicer when the vane is steering and your main rudder is fixed.
Yeah. And then the photos on the bottom right, those are actually, so for servo pendulum type systems, they don't actually have a rudder. They have kind of a paddle in the water, so that would not be effective as an emergency rudder. But a lot of them, like this, for example, is the one that Monitor offers, is you change out the paddle to an actual emergency rudder if you ever are in that situation. So all the wind vane manufacturers have thought of this for sure. Sounds great, but it won't fit my boat's davits, arch, radar mast, transom, Starlink, whatever you have. Maybe that's what you're thinking. We'll talk a little bit about installations. Firstly, I'll just see if there's any interesting questions here that might be relevant to talk about first. How large of a boat can a wind vane handle, and what are the different sizes?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Size is really based on displacement and the way the boat sails. It's not so much the size. We've done boats all the way up to 65 feet. The sort of general guideline is when you get up beyond 25 tons, 50,000 pound displacement, somewhere in there, then it really depends on the boat and how it sails. For really big boats, we actually go to dual units. So we'll supply 2 hydrovanes mounted on either side, which is 2 rudders and double the power. That's a pretty extreme circumstance because most cruising boats are not that big. If you're staying within the sort of 40 to 55 foot range, we can handle it. All manufacturers, I would say servo units would be probably pretty similar in terms of what they would recommend. The bigger the boat, the more attentive you have to be to not make sure the boat's not overpowered. You'll make sure you reef early. Don't be pushing the boat hard and going hull speed plus and expect the vane to steer. That really is the limitation.
Question, do Salty Dogs still get a discount? Yes, we do have a Salty Dog discount. I have a Hydrovane Levitt with the discount applied to the canvas cover for the unit. Normally it doesn't apply to parts orders, but twist our rubber arms, send us an email.
You can accommodate.
Yeah. Peter Taylor, I have an Aries that I've rebuilt and will be commissioning this year. What advice do you have to train orient a servo pendulum system, specifically the Aries? And that's a good question. Will's done quite a bit of sailing. Was it with an Aries or a wind pilot?
I sailed with a wind pilot, but
Yeah.
I do know the Aries. The Aries has a lot of different models, depending on which one you're talking about. The big thing with, I can't talk specifically to the Aries, but I know that for servo systems, the big thing is just making sure that you have 0 friction in the system and basically trying to eliminate, to make the run from the unit to the wheel or your tiller as frictionless as possible. So like try and minimize how many blocks it goes through, try to minimize having hard angles that the lines are going around. You also, if you have friction in your main steering, that can be an issue as well. They probably would have some of that information on their website, but I know that if they're set up properly on the right application, it can be a good fit. John's asking, what are the most common failure modes and what is the effect on steering? So I'm assuming referring to the Hydrovane. The most common failure would probably be, well, I mean, the vane covers will deteriorate in the sun.
The pin snap for sure. If you're locking it while you're motoring, there's, we have sacrificial $20 pins.
Yeah.
So definitely important to keep some of those as spares.
And if you hit something or, there was some major load put on the unit, you'd end up probably bending the shaft. That would be the first thing to break.
I mean, most of the things that we see broken, honestly, happen in a marina.
Yeah.
In the med backing, med mooring backing into the pier, or being hit by other boats in a marina. So,
Yeah.
and then there's probably other things that are damaged. We'll just cycle back in here to the installations because it might even answer some more questions. Specifically for the Hydrovane and installations, we have various components. So that is how we figure out what each boat needs. The drive unit is actually the same for all boats. Every boat will need 2 brackets to fit to the transom to hold the shaft assembly vertical. The brackets just depend on the nature of the transom. We will tell you exactly what you need. The shaft assembly, we do different lengths. They go up in 10-inch increments, and the size that you need really depends on the freeboard of the boat, and then also if you have any other gear or aerial obstructions. If there's an arch that we need to stay under, or if there's something we need to get above. Vane assemblies, we also have different types. Standard vane, then a stubby vane, which is shorter, wider to go fit underneath things. And the extendable vane, which is kind of a cool new vane in the last 5 years that you can extend up. So it's really great for the bigger, heavier boats, more leverage. Most common transom probably is the kind of swim step sugar scoop, and we do a lot of those. The nice thing is you can go off center. So there's really no effect on performance at all, and you get to keep your swim step. So it's been just awesome. I know some of the other manufacturers like Monitor has a swing gate, so you can kind of swing the whole unit out, but servo pendulum systems do have to be mounted center line because if their paddle ever comes out of the water, you run into a big problem. For the Hydrovane, because we have such a big long runner, it's never going to come out of the water. And also your main rudder being fixed provides a lot of that directional stability. So 50 years off center's never been a problem.
Yeah, I would say 80% of our installations are off center.
Yeah.
This is a good example of modern boat. This boat actually did the Arc Rally a few years back, and the Hydrovane was mounted over 4 feet off center. And he was one of our first big offsets with a drop down platform. And I asked him for some feedback on the other side. And he said, no, really, he found no point of sale that the vane couldn't perform. And the reality with these big modern boats and big drop down platforms is they're not designed to heel. If you're heeled over more than 10 or 15 degrees, you're just plowing more water and the boat's overpowered and it's harder to steer, and it shouldn't be sailed that way. So if they're sailed the way that they're supposed to, the vane will steer and the offset is really not a problem. Multi-hulls, this is a question we get more and more. Do they work on multi-hulls? The answer is yes. The only limitation would be performance cats or trimarans that are doing really high speeds. If they're doing 12 knots and 14 knots of wind, there's not a lot of apparent wind left over, and the apparent wind is changing too fast. But what we found is that most cruising cats are not fast. You're doing monohull speeds, sometimes a little bit faster. And the beauty with cats is because they don't heel, we can go way off center. There's no issue with rudder immersion. And we can supply longer shafts and an extended heading tube to get the whole vane up above the superstructure so it's not affected by dirty airflow. The key is that you've got to get the Hydrovane mounted as far aft as possible to maximize the leverage of the rudder. If it's mounted on the cross beam or somewhere further forward, you're really going to be taking away from performance, and it's not going to work as well as it should.
Yeah, and I mean, we've had lots and lots of testimonials over the past 20 years. I mean, more so in the past decade, I guess, of multi-hull owners, but we are really excited to do it ourselves. So getting one on our boat, of course, is the first thing we'll be doing in a month when we get back to Greece.
You want to do questions? Well,
We'll just maybe finish this part really quickly. Heavy boats, that was a question. So yes,
yeah,
we'll
this
kind of answer that. Oops.
that was the dual. You can see the picture in the middle and the top there. They're one of the boats that had dual hydrovanes. They went around Cape Horn. The 63-foot or below that actually had a single unit, and they got good performance out of it. And then we'd like to add in our 9-foot chubby girl. This is the
Smallest boat.
smallest boat we've ever supplied.
Yeah. And we do actually supply quite a few boats in like the 20-30 foot range.
Yeah.
Not that a 30-foot boat is small, but smaller by today's standards. Oh, the Oyster 575. Yeah, we spoke to him. That was actually on display at the Southampton Boat Show a few years ago, and he did the Oyster Around the World Rally. Yeah. Davits, we love davits for sure. We put davits on our last boat, the Jeanneau 43. It was kind of one of our must-haves, or not must-haves, like to haves. And it was great. With the Hydrovane, you can still have your dinghy on the davits usually and use the vane as long as the vane can pivot above and the rudder can turn below. There's kind of no moving part on the outside here. So we would just tie off our dinghy to the Hydrovane.
Yeah, it actually helps stabilize the
Yeah.
dinghy, kind of wedge it against the vane. As long as the vane can pivot above, we normally end up supplying a longer shaft or the extension on the heading tube
Yeah.
to get the vane up above, and then the dinghy rests against the drive unit.
Yeah.
It doesn't exactly fit for all boats. It just depends on how far aft the davits reach. But generally speaking, we are able to find ways to accommodate davits. Or on the next slide here, arches. If you've got an arch with some solar panels, we can use a shorter, wider vane to get the vane below the arch. Or we can do, in some extreme situations, we go with a longer shaft to get the vane above, depending on how you have it set up. The price range for wind vanes in general is going to be anywhere from $3,000 for a small lightweight servo unit to $7,000 for a full kitted out, double strat bracket, auxiliary rudder type system. That cost is interesting because a lot of people at boat shows will say, well, I'm thinking of just getting a second autopilot. And our answers are always, great, you can do that, but you're still vulnerable to all those exact same things that we talked about earlier and all the things in the system to support the autopilot. If you get hit by lightning, it doesn't matter how many autopilots you have, they're useless.
Or if your main rudder
If
breaks
something
or
happens to your
something,
main steer and you lose your autopilot.
you got nothing.
So I think from a cost standpoint, it's easier to justify that cost when you compare it to what it would cost to add a second autopilot. Depending on what you go for. And by the time you factor in the installation of an autopilot, which can be a little more complex, there's not a huge difference in price. And the fact that with a wind vane, you're getting the emergency rudder capabilities, you're killing two birds with one stone. And if you throw on top the tiller pilot, which I talked about earlier, that effectively gives you your redundant autopilot. So it's a good way to look at it.
Before we go there,
Yeah.
we actually do
there's
have,
more up.
I know, this is a cute question. What is the name of your Hydrovane, or the best name you've ever given to a Hydrovane, or you've ever heard given to a Hydrovane? So our last Hydrovane, actually, both of our last Hydrovanes were called Ernest. And that is because Will's dad, John, his middle name is Ernest. So we really liked it. So we're probably going to have an Ernest number 3 on the Leopard. Ernie. The best name that I've ever heard. We get a lot of Heidi.
Heidi's a pretty common one.
I like Charles, if that's the name of yours. Casper. Oh, the Hand of God.
That's a good question. I'm going to have to think more about that.
Yeah, there's some really good ones. They're just not coming to me right now. Oh,
named after a song.
We've all had Hydrovanes named after us. So there's a Will out there. There was a Gloria who used to live here. I think who used to work here. There's
Valerie.
a Valerie. There's a Brooklyn. Yeah, so we like those.
Harry, for Prince Harry.
Oh yeah, Prince Harry.
It's named after.
Okay, here is another Question, can a Hydrovane be self-installed or does it need to be professionally installed?
Yeah, good
Oh.
question. I would say that,
Either,
yeah, I would say that probably 50 to 60% of our customers install it themselves.
yeah,
Maybe even more than that. I'm not 100% on that, but the reality is any skilled rigger or marine trade can do the installation. We do have a network of installers that we can recommend to people. They don't obviously work for us, but they're just people that have done Hydrovane installations in the past.
yeah.
But it's not that complicated because it's not tied into your main steering and there is no critical positioning in terms of off-center or central mount.
You just have to get the shaft vertical. So it's cutting the tubes to the right length for the brackets and just making sure that you're doing a good job with the installation. I mean, you need to have heavy duty backing plates on the inside.
Which you can get from us.
Yeah, so that's kind of the main thing.
Yeah, and also I think it's just a matter of having confidence of being able to drill holes in your boat.
Yeah, yeah.
Sometimes it's easier to get someone else to do that, but once you do it a couple times, it's not a big deal. Next question from Jim is about what about backing up effect? Yeah, that's a good question. So
like in a marina or
yeah, I think it's for maneuvering. You've got a couple of different options. The servo systems, they usually have a hinging ability, so you can knock the servo up and get it out of the water. With the Hydrovane, you can also get it out of the water. You have a locking pin that holds the rudder on. And as soon as you pull that pin, the rudder drops off and then you can pull it onto the boat. It's easy to do if you've got a sugar scoop style transom or an accessible transom, but if you've got an older traditional transom, it can be a little more cumbersome. What a lot of boats, especially some boats that have full keels or skeg rudders and the boats don't handle that well when you're reversing, what we recommend is leave the Hydrovane rudder on and put an extension on the Hydrovane tiller and actually use the Hydrovane rudder to improve your steerage. There's some nifty ways. You can go on our website and see some pictures. There's some nifty ways of how you can handle that. The only limitations with that would be if you're a center cockpit, it's a longer run, and you'd have to have someone else doing that for you. But you can actually use the rudder to improve your maneuverability. The third option is just to pin it to lock it off fore and aft. So you insert the shaft pin and then the rudder's basically fixed. That's okay if it's not a tight maneuvering situation, but it will increase your turning radius for sure.
Yeah, you just have to kind of get used to it.
Mm-hmm.
And if the rudder's off center and hit something, will it pop off without breaking or would it break? More likely that the shaft might bend. We've seen that. So yeah, I mean, most Hydrovanes are installed off center. Things do get hit offshore, but it's not all that common, of course.
Normally when people hit stuff,
other things go wrong at the same time.
No, what I was going to say is you normally end up hitting the keel or the main rudder and then it deflects outboard.
Yeah.
It's not that often that the Hydrovane gets hit.
No.
It'll snag stuff like lobster pots or, lines and stuff, but it doesn't get hit very often.
Yeah, bad luck for sure. Okay, so we just have a couple more things. Let's see. Charles Vane, the pirate, I like it. Quickly, if we have time, I'm not sure what the time is here. I think we'll probably just take a video.
This is crossing the sea of Cortez.
Serving at the bar tonight. I think that diaper's a bit wet. Gibby, come to the bar. Come up to the bar for your dinner. Come up to the bar for your dinner. Okay. So good. Sunset at sea. Just sitting over the Baja. Ernie steering. Seas have calmed down. Big fish got away already. That's really serene considering our situation with the twins. Awesome. Yeah, so we look back at that now and we're like, no passage can be more difficult than steering with 1.5-year-old twins. So you need all the help you can get.
Is that our final slide?
Yeah.
That was really neat to see. I'm glad that you shared that with us. And I can imagine that, that made it a lot easier for your passage.
Oh gosh, yeah. We need
Well,
every system.
The reality is, with kids on board, I'm basically single-handing a lot of the time. 'Cause
Yeah.
Sarah's down below attending the noise,
Yeah.
doing everything else. So it's important that you set the boat up for single-handed sailing.
Absolutely. It adds a whole new level of multitasking, I think.
It
Yeah.
does.
Well, thank you. Really appreciate that you guys took the time again to be here to talk to us about this. I really enjoyed that live demo. That was helpful for my visualization of this. So thank you. And looks like Peter's just saying thank you for the great presentation. Oh, his vein is named Billy. So
Billy.
Really nice. I like that.
I like that.
That was a good
Amazing.
question about the vein names, because we do get that a lot, and we should almost be writing like a list of
I
what
know,
people
we
call their
do.
hydrovanes.
yeah, that would be a great add to the website.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for inviting us to be here and for being here to host it. And we really, we appreciate our involvement with the Salty Dogs. And we hope to do the rally too one day once we get over to the Atlantic and up the Eastern Seaboard, and then want to head back down. So there
Oh,
we
that's
go.
great. Glad to hear that. And thank you again. And everybody, hope to see you next week at the next one. Thank you.
Okay,
Okay,
thanks.
see you later.
Bye.